since it's 10 o'clock, why don't we go ahead and get started? For those of you who may not know me, I'm Jennifer Baker. I am one of your legislative advocates, and here today with me is the phenomenal David Walrath, who has been your legislative advocate for quite a number of years, one of the most knowledgeable people about teachers' retirement issues that I know of. So you're in for a treat. We're going to be talking to you this morning about what every retiree should know about the future of CalSTRS funding. We are going to go into quite a bit of technical information. So if you need your cup of coffee, I would strongly encourage you to make sure you're fully caffeinated for this one. You don't need to worry about taking notes. We are going to make this, the PowerPoint available, and we'll send it out to everyone that did register. But we do have a few housekeeping items that we wanted to go over this morning for the webinar. If you are in a quiet place, that would be very helpful. If you could turn off your video and turn off your sound, we would appreciate it. That way, in case you have to take a phone call, we don't have to hear your phone call. We would like to ask you to please put your questions in the chat box. We are going to be taking questions at the end of the webinar. If we're able to integrate some of the questions in while we're doing the workshop, we will try to do that. If there is time at the end of the webinar, we might have the opportunity for people to ask some questions. And if we do get to that, please use the raise hand feature. And for those of you that may not have used that feature before, it's in the black boxes that you have at the bottom. And I do see one question from Johanna before we start.
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you. I just want to let you guys know we just determined that there is a passcode needed to get into this meeting. We are emailing the passcode to everybody that previously registered, so you might get some late apologies. We're new, you know, apologies. Thank you.
So I think what Johanna is saying, we have had some technical difficulties this morning that we're working on addressing as quickly as possible. So, so with that, I'm going to ask you if you could please all make sure that you are muted. And if you don't mind turning off your video, that way you're just going to see myself and Dave. And we're going to go ahead and get started. So we're going to start out by talking about the current funding plan for CalSTRS, and that's known as AB 1469, and that was passed in 2014. That was an extremely comprehensive 32-year plan that would fully fund CalSTRS by the year 2046. So I first wanted to note that the funding plan is absolutely working. It's doing a phenomenal job. And
Jennifer.
Yes.
Yep. Who all worked on developing that plan?
And just so you know, Dave and I, we're going to be doing a tag team this morning. We want to make sure this is fun as well. So there were a comprehensive number of stakeholders that were involved in this funding plan. This was not an overnight process. It took years. I actually remember spending around 10 years knocking on doors in the legislature. A number of stakeholders worked on this, including labor and management organizations. There were dozens of hearings that took place over the course of a few years, and it was extremely comprehensive. So everyone that wanted to participate in the process was able to participate in the process. Would you say that's a fair statement, Dave?
Very fair. And another question, was this partisan or bipartisan?
Oh, very good question. It was extremely bipartisan. As a matter of fact, this was one of the most bipartisan issues that moved forward. And this made the situation very unique We're going to talk about what some other states have been doing. We're going to touch on that a little later in this workshop and the workshop next week. And so the process that we took here in California was a very different process than what a number of other states have done. And it really showed the comprehensive collaboration that took place between stakeholders, CalSTRS, the legislature, and the governor. And some of the components in the funding plan included increasing contribution rates for educators, for employers, and for the state. So those contribution rates have been phasing up over time. And as a result, they brought the funding ratio for CalSTRS to 67.1%. And this was as of June 30th of last year. We're working on getting updated numbers, but what I understand is it's still hovering around 67%. The Teachers Retirement Board, and they are the board that oversees CalSTRS. So typically we always hear the word CalSTRS. So if you think of the CalSTRS board, that is the Teachers Retirement Board. In AB 1469, they were given limited authority to increase contribution rates, and they're able to increase the state's contribution rate up to 0.5% annually. But this is statutory, which means if there needs to be some tweaks included in the budget bill, that might happen. And we did see that in 2020. The state was having a little bit of some fiscal difficulty, and so they skipped the state's 0.5% payment. Fortunately, in this last year's, this most recent budget that was passed in July, that actually made up that skip payment, plus all of the interest and additional costs that accumulated because of the lack of that payment. So the good news is that brings the state funding back on track. And the Teachers Retirement Board also has the ability to either increase or lower employer contribution rates up to 1%. The maximum rate that they're able to increase employer contribution rates is 20.25%. We are going to be talking a little bit about what those employer contribution rates are in this next slide, and did want to note that it's very important for us to monitor those conversations, even if we're talking about the fact that this impacts a number of active employees, because that has an impact in the total amount of funding that districts have at the local level. As you know, things have been a little complicated lately at the local level because of so many new factors that are impacting education, that's impacting the number of teachers that are retiring, it's impacting the number of substitutes and teachers that are available. And so all of those factors do play a role in creating this, this retirement soup that we're going to be discussing. Dave, I'm going to turn this next slide over to you.
Thank you. And the point Jennifer was making regarding contribution rates, prior to the full funding legislation, CalSTRS did not have the right to increase contribution rates. So what had happened was, unlike CalPERS, which does California Public Employees Retirement System, which did have the ability to increase contribution rates, CalSTRS had to go back to the legislature and ask for the legislature to increase rates. That is why this took so long to reach the full funding legislation, the 10 years.
And Dave, could you also comment on why it was important to have a conversation about limiting the authority? What makes the board's ability somewhat controversial to raise rates?
Right, and so they have the authority, and as Jennifer says, there was a cap on that authority. Unlike CalPERS, which doesn't have a cap, the stakeholder groups wanted to ensure there was a cap for a couple of reasons. One reason was that they did not want the cost of the contribution rate to keep going up because that takes money out of funds that are available for other purposes. And so would a system that did not have a cap all of a sudden become overfunded and significantly overfunded by increasing contribution rates? The second was a concern that potentially a governor who appoints most of this CalSTRS board could use those appointees to threaten contribution rate increases as a leverage against the stakeholder groups on negotiations for other issues. So it became a concern that a governor would have that ability to use CalSTRS for non-CalSTRS related concerns. Because we were all part of this discussion, Jennifer, myself, Association of California School Administrators were very involved as well. And we had gone through the years of reform that Governor Schwarzenegger had proposed, which the original proposals from Governor Schwarzenegger when he first became governor were such that they would have created great problems for maintaining CalSTRS and teachers' retirement benefits. So that caused a little bit of concern from all of us that what if we had a governor who didn't care about retirement, did not care about ensuring the teachers had adequate retirement? Would that governor then take apart the benefit structure that we had all fought to create? So that was an issue, and that was one of the reasons for the cap. Other than the state has no cap. But the employer and the employee have caps that are based upon calculations that are not easily changeable. So it's the 2% at 60 members that you see on this contribution rates. Those are the ones, the members who were employed in CalSTRS positions, covered positions, mainly certificated employees, librarians, counselors, nurses, and administrators who are certificated prior to January 1, 2013. 2% at 62 are new members hired after teachers, nurses, et cetera. After that date, their contribution rate is determined on the normal cost of the California State Teachers Retirement System. Normal cost is what is the cost of the benefit earned in that particular year. And so it's trying to make sure that there's not a new unfunded obligation created for those newly hired individuals. That can fluctuate, but it can only be changed when there's a significant increase in the normal cost calculations. And Jennifer will get into this a little bit when we start talking about some of the statutory issues related to contribution rate changes. So as Jennifer indicated, you'll see under the employer side, the contribution rates. You see the statutory, and then in parentheses, the actual rate. And that is because in 2019-20, in the subsequent 2 years, the state has provided additional funding from State General Fund to CalSTRS in order to reduce the employer's contribution rate. And this was to address some of the funding issues, particularly those that were occurring during the time of the pandemic, that were expected to reduce the amount of money that was available for public schools, K-14. So the state made that attempt to try to balance the contribution rate changes. And you'll see that those numbers, the state continued doing that, but that ends in 22-23. You'll see in red, these are all estimates. These are all projections. And they're based upon the assumptions that CalSTRS uses when they're projecting out their future costs. 20.1, the state is capped at, the employer is capped at 20.25, as stated. You'll see the 2% at 62 members going up from 10.205 to 10.705. That is showing an estimate that the normal cost of the system will be going up. These estimates are based on the assumptions of what is the rate of return? What is the longevity? What is inflation? What is the covered payroll upon which contributions will be paid? Those types of different factors that are being projected out. Excuse me a sec. A couple of things on the contribution rates and the ability for public schools to pay them, the employers. Rather than having the absolute loss of state revenue when the pandemic hit and was expected to significantly reduce state revenue, the state revenues actually increased from 2019-20 to 2021, and now projected to increase even more in the next year. The one will be starting the next fiscal year, state fiscal year, starting July 1, 2021, the one we're in right now. And then 2022-23, July 1, 2022. The state's revenues increased so much that public school funding under Proposition 98, for K-14, went up by $9 billion. Each 1 percentage point of contribution rate increase cost about $375 million. 2%, about $750 million. So when you look at the new money that came in, that the actuals in the $9 billion, the concerns that were there on the ability of the employers to pay the contribution rate at 19.1 or 20.1 are not as great, because it had been thought of, instead of an increase, there would be an absolute reduction of close to $6 to $7 billion. A tremendous swing from a minus $6 to $7 billion to a plus $9. So that will be part of the discussion for the next budget that's proposed by the governor that will come out on January 10th of 2022, which used to seem to be a long time, but it's just around the corner now. 3 short months, we'll be seeing the next governor's budget proposal and what that budget expects in employer contribution rates, state and contribution, and whether they will be expecting a change in the 2% at 62 members. The contribution rate for 2% at 60 is locked in law and statute. The 2% at 62, the newer members, that is the one that can fluctuate and might fluctuate. And we'll have an estimate of that when we see the governor's budget come out in January. This is an example of how the contribution rates have been changing. Prior to the full funding, the state rate was 8.25. The employee was 8. and the state was 2.17, I believe, based upon the second prior year's covered payroll. You'll see the significant change. That is because the unfunded obligation had grown for CalSTRS. The contributions coming in were not going to be enough to pay benefits. And at the end of about 36 years, CalSTRS was going to be broke, had almost zero money. That is why we had to have significant contribution rate increases for both members, employers, and the state to avoid that situation.
Dave, can I add something on that? And the employer rate used to be 8.25%. And, you know, those rates hadn't really changed for around 30 years. So unlike other pension systems like CalPERS, the public employment retirement system, those rates would fluctuate potentially annually because their board does have authority to change contribution rates. We took that into consideration when AB 1469 was being discussed, because the one thing that there was a realization by the stakeholders that by having constantly fluctuating contribution rates where you didn't know if they were going to go up or down next year, you didn't know necessarily what those rates were going to be, that makes it very different for our local education agencies to be able to plan their 3-year budget cycle. And that was one of the reasons why the contribution rates that were set for the employers were phased in over time, so that employers could have an opportunity to plan and prepare for what those contribution rates were going to be. And even though during some of the initial years of the increases, employers were receiving less funding overall because of some cuts, fortunately, at least we're in a different trajectory, but at least there's an opportunity for employers to know what's going to be included in the future, to at least ensure that they can plan for changes in pension costs to make that more predictable.
Correct. And that is a significant benefit. The CalPERS, because they can adjust and did, they were considered to have less of a problem on unfunded obligation. Actually, it turned out that they had a greater problem because they gave both the state and the employers pension holidays, where their contribution rate was zero. CalSTRS did not have the same type of pension holidays that CalPERS had. So CalPERS had much greater fluctuations, and all of a sudden school districts may have a zero contribution rate, and in the next year be told it was going to be 5.5%. Difficulty for planning and budgeting for everybody. So CalSTRS has been very transparent in their contribution rates and how the changes can occur, and providing advanced information to school districts, employers, on what their contribution rates would look like so they can plan. Very open, very transparent process. Next
Dave,
slide.
Before we move on, can you comment a little, because I know that a number of our members may not be familiar with what the GAN limit is. What is it, and why should we even care about the GAN limit? What could that possibly have to do with funding CalSTRS?
Great question. The GAN limit, named after Paul Gann, Proposition 4, 1979. Jarvis Gann were the two major proponents for Proposition 13 of 1978, property tax change legislation, well, proposition. The year after that, Paul Gann came with Proposition 4 to essentially lock in the tax savings that occurred because of Proposition 13. That the state wouldn't be able to just increase its taxes and replace through state tax increases the property tax savings that were created for local homeowners, local property tax that were created by Prop 13. So that put a cap on appropriations subject to limitation. The limitation was in Proposition 4. If the state had more money coming in because of its tax structure than what the Constitution allowed it to spend, the appropriations, then the excess amount had to be returned to taxpayers. That provision has been amended a couple of times. Proposition 98 amended it to say the money would be split in half. Half would go back to taxpayers, half would go to school districts on an equal amount per enrollment, K-14. So it's been amended a couple of times, but it still is there that if the state has significant revenue greater than the amount that can be appropriated over a 2-year period, it has to be returned. What the situation is the calculation treats reserves and appropriation out of reserves, money going in and out a little bit differently than is the case when you're not subject to the limitation. So the state had used some of its reserves in order to buy down pension debt. Because in the long run, if you pay some of the debt early, then that investment earns money and reduces the long-term cost. Now, money today is better than money tomorrow. The Gann limit changed that dynamic a little bit to make it harder for the state to pay off some of the unfunded obligation early because of how the limit is calculated. So that has created a situation where when the state has excess revenue, excess meaning greater than appropriation, it cannot be used in the same way as Governor Brown used greater state revenues to pay off long-term debts. And so it has made our whole funding structure discussions more complex than they had been prior to hitting the limit, which occurred this year, which was one of the reasons why there was the $8.6 billion in rebates that were provided. And the legislature has made some other adjustments along the way. All of this, for the good news is state is doing very well financially. Silicon Valley is doing very well. The tech industry is doing very well, all of which has created the situation where state general fund revenues are greater than anticipated and have reached the limit of the appropriations. So that is a plus, but that plus, unfortunately for us, trying to pay off the unfunded obligation as soon as possible, it makes it a little bit more difficult to do that. So what factors can change? The primary factor that can change, if we can go to the next slide, is how much money is earned on investments. The CalSTRS benefit is funded almost 60% by the investment earnings from the contributions that are paid. The assumption is that those will be invested, they'll earn money, and those earnings will then be used to pay for the retirees' benefits and retirement. The current rate of return is assumed to be 7%. And this is a blended rate because CalSTRS has a tremendously diversified portfolio. Fixed income, bonds that pay fixed amount of interest, real estate, equities, those types of investments, equity stocks, stock market, mutual funds. The diversity is also not simply in the type of investment, meaning stock, bond, real estate, et cetera, but also how much in the asset allocation within equities goes to particular types of equities. And that can be emerging markets, more stable, such as utilities, are cutting edge, such as Facebook. Oh, it's not as cutting edge as it was a decade ago. Those types. So how do you do the asset allocation as well? And so the investment branch of CalSTRS will look at how do they allocate the investments in order to reach the rate of return that has been adopted by the Teachers Retirement Board. And right now that's 7%. It had been a decade ago 8%. But in looking out into the future, it was believed that the type of growth in the future would not be as great as the type of economic growth that had occurred in the past. With that assumption, the asset allocation, they have held on to 7% for the past 4 years. Last year, they had a greater than 20% return, which is very positive. That amount, however, is the classic, I think it was Jerry Brown's comment of, recession's going to come, which Governor Brown seemed to make every year. We will have another economic downturn. That 20% is, the 7% is expected to happen year after year after year after year. We all know that won't occur because we do have economic booms, we do have recessions. So the 20% is kind of factored in that we need that in some years in order to make up for the years in which it may only be 1% or minus 1%. The board is discussing whether they should change the 7%. The discussion may be down to 6.75. They tend to make their changes in 1/4 of a percent actions. If that occurs, that means this investments will earn less on their assumptions, so their projections going into the future. That would increase the unfunded actuarial obligation. And this is, once again, the projection of how much money will be available to pay for the benefits that have already been earned. And if it's not enough money projected, then you have an unfunded actuarial obligation. Each 1/4%, 11 billion. If they do make a rate change, that will have an impact on the state, the district employers, and on the 2% at 62. Remember that prior slide when we talked about those who can have their contribution rate change, the newer members hired after January 1, 2013. They would be impacted as well because the normal cost will go up. the cost of the benefit will go up because the earnings will go down. So in order to pay for the benefit with less earnings, you have to have a higher contribution rate. Those are some of the possible effects of a rate change. We do not know if the board is going to do this or not, but they have, as I said earlier, reduced their return from 8% of about a decade ago down to 7% now. The other public pension systems have been looking at 6.75 or 6.8 rate of return. So this is a conversation that is occurring across the public employee pension system universe.
And Dave, before I go on to the next slide, I'd actually like to add 2 more comments to the last 2 bullets. And just to note, it's a big if. We don't know if the board is going to feel that they need to do this or not. It's still early. If they did choose to move in this direction, it wouldn't mean that AB 1469 is eliminated. What it might mean is somewhat of an acknowledgement that, well, instead of having the CalSTRS fully funded by 2046, maybe it's going to be 2050. Right? So it doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily see a number of extreme changes that would happen to the funding plan, but more it may be a good time for a reassessment to say, okay, where are we now? And if we see this change, how many potential additional years would it take to get there, or would we need any other tweaks to take place? So I did want to note that if they needed to change the rate of return, it wouldn't mean that we're not going to continue to see AB 1469 doing the tremendous work that it is doing. But I also wanted to note that if they did have to make that change, and we did see our PEPRA members, those that were hired after 2013, paying additional costs, it's important to remember, while it's very early now because these are active employees, when they eventually retire, they're retiring with a much lower retirement benefit than the previous population. They're also taking home less because they're paying higher contribution rates as active employees. So we have looked at different tiers in our retirees for a number of years. We've got those that retired prior to 1999. When we start seeing this population beginning to retire, that may necessitate, even though it's a while in the future, but a number of different considerations to try to provide some type of equity for those members. So long-term conversations to think about. They don't impact us now, but it's important to recognize that there is a very different retirement benefit that those members will have.
There was a question asked about the $11 billion. The $11 billion is not per year. The $11 billion is over the next 30 years. The system will have to find another $11 billion. So it's spread out. It's like essentially kind of like refinancing your mortgage. You're now going to spread it. You took some money out. Your mortgage went up. So you need to find some money over the next 30, 35 years to cover that increase in your mortgage. But it's not a per year, it's balanced. So in looking at it that way, what you're talking about is significantly less than $300 million a year plus investment return is what the implications of an $11 billion increase in the unfunded obligation. The unfunded obligation right now is about $107 billion. $107 billion. But the payment plan, full payment plan, we'll reduce that to 0 in 2046. When all this was put together, we did talk about relooking after 10 years and then readjusting if necessary on the full payment plan, because we were running and using estimates, and we will have 10 years of experience. So we'll probably have some discussion in another couple of years on what type of tweaks ought to be made. There's a question on if the market should crash hugely, what would happen to those about to or in retirement now? Nothing. There's enough in assets. What is it, Jennifer? About $300 billion in assets in CalSTRS right now?
It's significant. Yeah, it's even higher. The good news is the fund is actually performing very, very strongly, and they've even created mechanisms that anticipate downturn. So it's almost as if they're betting against the market in certain areas. So if this is one of the things that they learned from the Great Recession of 2008, that they need to have a plan in case there's a downturn that helps to provide a cushion so that CalSTRS is not impacted as much as it would have been. So they do plan for that. It doesn't mean there wouldn't be an impact, but also remember, that's only 1 year. This is, as Chris Ailmans noted, this is a cruise ship. So they're looking at not just 1 year, but 10 years, 20, 30 years. And the market, as we've seen, can change dramatically even after a downturn.
And so, and we will be continuing to take questions as we go forward. But what are some of the statutory fluctuations?
So there are a number of considerations to think about. And when Dave was going over that matrix earlier, and we saw the increases in employer contributions, initially that was something that was difficult for employers to process, because at the same time that they saw increases in their overall pension costs, we were not seeing the necessary increases that employers were hoping to see in overall education funding. However, that trajectory has significantly changed. And so we have seen monumental amounts of additional funding going to our schools. But there are still continuing conversations that the employers are seeking to try to see if there's an opportunity to get an extension of that pension contribution relief for employers. So we don't necessarily know what's going to be the complete outcome, but since those contribution rate buy downs end in 22-23, I anticipate that is going to be a significantly prominent discussion in regard to this next budget for our schools and our community colleges. And so that may be a colorful topic, but what will make it tricky is the impact that the GAN limit will have on that discussion. Because if we're looking at let's say buying down additional unfunded obligations at the same time, because typically both Governor Brown and Governor Newsom, they each did two things. They each paid a big chunk. So it's think about if you've got a mortgage and you make an extra payment, a very large extra payment, that's going to reduce your the overall money that you owe. So both Governor Brown and Governor Newsom have done that to both CalPERS and CalSTRS, and then in addition, provided contribution rate relief. So if we do see an interest in that conversation again, what's going to be tricky is the fact that the money that would be used to pay down the additional unfunded obligation that we have for CalSTRS would trigger the GAN limit, which would mean that that money is going to have to be somewhat offset. It gets very complicated, but essentially it means it's going to make it more difficult for the legislature to have that kind of a conversation, because it means they're also going to have to address some other conversations on the other side of the ledger. So it's not going to be as easy politically or fiscally as it was in the past. That could prove to be a challenge when it comes to addressing additional unfunded obligation payments. Another aspect to consider, and I noted this earlier in the webinar, is that when there have been shortfalls to public pension plans across the nation, instead of doing what we've done in California, they've said, oh, there's a shortfall, it's no good anymore, let's just eliminate it. But that has had dire consequences for the future of teaching in those states, because not only do we have the teacher shortage in our state, but that is magnified in a number of other states. So instead of helping to create a positive environment where teachers are incentivized to have long-term security through a defined benefit plan, legislatures across the nation have actually been doing the opposite and eliminating that. But it's something that we're always monitoring, because we're always looking at potential threats to CalSTRS. And so we bring it up to make sure that you're just aware that those conversations have taken place. We're going to be commenting it in next week's webinar as well. But we have seen legislators in California occasionally introduce a bill that would eliminate CalSTRS and or CalPERS, or would significantly change the plan from a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan. So a defined contribution plan would be somewhat similar to a 401k plan. And some people can say, oh, well, what's wrong with the 401k? You know, my spouse or partner may have that in the private sector. That plan is only good as long as there's money in the plan, but you might actually outlive the money that you have in that plan. And what happens then? One of the great benefits to a defined benefit plan is it's a modest but secure pension that's going to be there for the duration of your life. But I did want to make sure that you are aware that there are always individuals that are trying to attack that. And then in addition, there are some that simply think that educators and public employees, you simply make too much money. And so we need to try to reduce the overall pension benefits that individuals receive. These are some of the conversations that we had to fight against back when the initial Public Employment Pension Reform Act was being discussed and debated when Governor Brown was there. One of the aspects we had to counter, one of the arguments in support of creating PEPRA was the fact that they had to eliminate pension holidays. And folks on the CalSTRS side said, wait a minute, we've never had pension holidays for CalSTRS. Many of the justifications for creating PEPRA and essentially creating a two-tier retirement plan for all public employees, many of the justifications for that were things that simply didn't happen within the CalSTRS system, yet we were all lumped in. So there have been occasional individuals who have begun to have colorful discussions about the need for another bite of the apple with PEPRA. That has come up occasionally. We work to pay attention to those conversations, but should the Teachers Retirement Board decide that they may need to make a change in contributions, I would anticipate we're probably going to see a lot of the detractors come out and say, oh, look, this isn't working. We need to eliminate everything. Some are looking for any opportunity to try to bring up their justifications for eliminating CalSTRS. So we did want to let you know we're already anticipating that. They're not valid, but we do make sure that we're trying to address those issues as they're being discussed. So a couple of other things that we wanted to bring up that are really important, and especially for retirees. You know, active employees are really focused on what's happening in the classroom now. And oftentimes it's not until you're retired that you realize, oh my goodness, there are a number of other benefits that are extremely important. And I didn't realize how important this is as a retiree until you need it. One of those major issues is the supplemental benefit maintenance account. And this account protects our retirees. It protects their purchasing power from inflation. As you have been noticing in the market lately, inflation looks like it's going to be a major issue that's going to be around for a number of years. So the SBMA fund, as we also call it, is going to be a very important topic of conversation. And what happens with the SBMA is once the earnings of your initial retirement allowance becomes lower than 85%, which is the rate that it's currently at, you will get a quarterly check from CalSTRS that will make up the difference. So let's say that you haven't been retired as long, but you've now fallen into the category where you can get the SBMA benefit. Let's say that your retirement check has eroded to 80%. Well, then you're going to get a quarterly check from CalSTRS that's going to make up the difference for 5%. We have retirees that are over 100 years old. So the inflation may have impacted their retirement earnings significantly, which means their quarterly check may be much more significant. And that might be the difference of helping them to stay afloat economically. Dave, I know that you wanted to also comment on SBMA. What are some other important aspects that our members need to be aware of?
Well, one of the things we were talking about is rate of return. The Supplemental Benefit Maintenance Account has money in the account to pay for the benefit, and it also earns investment. They receive the projected rate of return into that account because you don't want the rate of return, the actual funding to go up and down and up and down, because you have to have guarantee assurance that the individuals who have lost the purchasing power are protected going forward. So if the board were to reduce the rate from 7% down to 6.75, that means less money in subsequent years would be allocated to the SBMA. CalSTRS has guaranteed us that they'd still be able to pay the full 85% purchasing power. Right now, you can see at the bottom, there's a quote reserve based upon estimates and projections of $11.2 billion in the account. You see how many people are receiving. Because the base calculation uses the annual improvement factor, which is a 2% simple. Whenever inflation is 2% or more, then you'll have increased costs in the SBMA. More people will become eligible. We recently have been seeing 3.5%, 4% inflation, could be 5% in the current year. That will put greater pressure on being able to fund the benefits. SBMA came about because of the large inflation that occurred in the 1970s and early 80s. Jerry Brown, in his first term of governor, signed the first purchasing power bill in 1982. Oh, by the way, this bill was signed mainly because there were mail bags full of letters from teachers and retired teachers asking the governor to sign it. There's a picture of his desk just covered with envelopes on this bill. Advocacy works. For those of you who want to become involved in advocacy, this program is a great example of advocacy works. So it is there. We're talking about, because inflation is increasing, because we have a number of people who still are less than 100% protected, and we would like to keep people at 100%. There have been discussions of trying to increase the benefit for those who've been retired the longest at the lowest rate, some of our older members. And this we refer to as SBMA option 1. There's discussion on whether this is possible to be done. We're looking at it. No action has been taken. What it would do is say for those who retired prior to 1999, they would get a one-time increase, and it's a one-time going into their base. So they get it each year for them on it based upon percentage of when they retired. So if you retired in the 1990s, you would have 1% increase. If it was the 1980s, it would be another. 1970s would be yet a third. So there's different situations there, but once again, trying to look at those who've been harmed the most by inflation, trying to take care of them through option 1. All of this will be part of the calculations of the next actuarial valuation and the assumptions that will be there. But there is that conversation that we hope that we'll be able to have in order to make an improvement for some of the members. Next slide. So what's up? What's coming?
So we wanted to give you a sneak. I wanted to give you a sneak peek of the next workshop. And so what we're going to be covering next week are some of the major issues that CalSTRS is going to face within the next 5 years. And we are getting into a lot of technical information that you don't necessarily hear as either an active or a retiree, because we want you to really understand some of the macro issues that are going to be impacting CalSTRS funding, the level of pension costs that employers are going to be paying, the opportunities for trying to get changes in things like the SBMA. All of these issues are completely interrelated. And by understanding these issues in a more comprehensive way, not only is it more educational for you, but when the time comes for you to, we're going to call on you to that either advocate to a legislator to urge them to support a bill that might change the SBMA and enhance those benefits, or if we're going to need additional assistance for CalSTRS, we want to make sure that you understand the why. Why is it important? How does it impact me? What we're constantly working on doing is ensuring that CalSTRS is very strong fiscally in the long run, not only to protect your retirement benefit, but also to protect the retiree benefits of those in the future. That is why we're going over these issues, because not only is your retirement secure, but we also want you to know that we're working to make sure it maintains that security. So at next week's webinar, we're going to be talking about what we're going to be diving in a little more deeply into what the changes in contribution rates could mean for the shortfall in the funding plan. We touched on it a little bit, but there is quite a bit of interesting conversations that can actually take place around those issues. So you can start to get into Dave's mind and my mind and understand what are the conversations that that happen in and around the legislature when it comes to these issues. And then how can that impact CalSTRS stakeholders? Various stakeholders may look at this in different ways. How will that impact the conversations that we're going to have at the legislature? Can it impact our PEPRA members even more? You know, some have come, you know, folks have had conversations in the Capitol saying we need to provide relief to employers for increasing pension costs. Could there potentially be future discussions that say, well, we need to provide relief for the actual members from those increases as well? Because it was PEPRA that changed the normal cost of retirement for new members and said, you now have to pay for 50% of those costs. Will the teacher shortage impact those conversations? There are a number of different issues that are going to be discussed over the next 5 years. And then also, as we talked about before, how is the budget process changing because of the integration of the GAN limit? That is likely going to be one of the biggest hot topics when it comes to additional pension funding. And we want to explore those conversations a little bit more. And then specifically talk about, well, could this spill over into other political conversations that we may be having, such as changing some of the rules around the SBMA? We want to have conversations, and we may be looking at conversations with the legislature about the audit process that CalSTRS has and the way in which they are requiring retirees to pay for overpayments that were not the fault of retirees. There are a number of conversations that we've been having with CalSTRS, the legislature, Department of Finance, and additional stakeholders. Some of those discussions could be potentially impacted by some of these macro pension issues that we're raising. So we just want you to make sure that you understand how all of these issues can impact you. They might not impact you directly, but eventually you're going to be impacted by the SBMA. We want to make sure it's safe and secure for you. We want to make sure it's there for you. And we would love to see that increase. A dream would be to see that at 100% one day, but it's going to take a number of years to get there. But we're constantly exploring conversations.
And so, Jennifer, will this include potential legislation, as you mentioned, but also initiatives that could be on the ballot?
Initiatives. Yeah, you may or may not have seen the legislative alert that we sent out yesterday. There are 2 voucher initiatives that have been filed. Not only will they have significant impacts on education as we know it, but it would also have a significant impact on CalSTRS retirement that a lot of individuals may not necessarily be aware of. We're actually going to delve into some of those issues. It's still very early. We don't even want to see them qualify, but we want to make sure that we make you aware of some of the hazards and roadblocks that are being thrown out there that could impact your retirement in the future.
So many issues for next week's webinar, which will be at 10 o'clock on October 21st. We look forward to seeing you on that webinar.
And with that, we do have just a few minutes. If there are any questions, I would love to encourage you to use the chat box if you've got any questions and wanted to stay. If there are no additional questions, then we'd like to say thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We know it's a lot of information. It is very technical, but we want to make sure that you understand how your retirement works and what we're doing to make sure that we protect it. So thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next week, and I hope you have a great week in the meantime. Take care, everyone.